Star Trek just topped Enterprise's classic Carbon Creek episode. When Star Trek Enterprise aired its second season gem Carbon Creek in 2002, few could have predicted it would become a fan favorite, not just of Enterprise, but of the entire Star Trek franchise. The episode stood out because it told a quiet, intimate story about Vulcans stranded in 1950s America, with little connection to Starfleet, warp drives, or even Captain Archer's crew. It was a character study wrapped in a retro sci-fi tale, showing that Star Trek could still thrive without phasers and space battles. For years, Carbon Creek was held up as one of the best side stories the franchise had ever told. But now, more than 2 decades later, Star Trek has quietly and triumphantly topped it. Thanks to the franchise's modern era of streaming storytelling, Star Trek Strange New Worlds has managed to blend the classic episodic structure of the original series with the emotional nuance and cinematic ambition of prestige TV. And it's in this environment that the episode Among the Lotus Eaters Season 2, Episode 4 managed to outdo Carbon Creek, not by imitating it, but by evolving the core idea that alien stories become most powerful when rooted in very human ideas of memory, identity, and connection. Why Carbon Creek worked so well. Before we dive into Strange New Worlds, it's important to understand why Carbon Creek became such a standout. On the surface, it was a flashback story told by Topol, describing the crash landing of a Vulcan survey crew in 1957 Pennsylvania. Stranded with no means of contacting their people, 3 Vulcans had to assimilate into American society. One of them, Mestral, becomes enamored with human culture, even choosing to remain behind voluntarily after rescue. Carbon Creek was Star Trek in its most reflective mode. It examined the beginnings of Vulcan-human curiosity long before first contact, subtly rewriting Starfleet history while making an argument for cross-cultural empathy. It also gave Jolene Blalock Topol the chance to play a layered, emotional role beyond the typically stoic Vulcan, proving that Trek's so-called quiet episodes could still carry weight. More than anything, Carbon Creek was about connection. It imagined that before diplomacy or space travel, understanding came from listening, observing, and learning to care about the other. And it made a compelling case that humanity was always worth the trouble, even in our more primitive, Cold War-rattled past. But Carbon Creek still had one foot in nostalgia. It was charming, but also safe. It didn't really challenge the characters telling the story Topol, Archer, and Trip. It remained, mostly, a Vulcan bedtime story, albeit a beautifully crafted one. Enter Among the Lotus Eaters, memory, trauma, and the soul of Starfleet. Now contrast that with Strange New Worlds, Among the Lotus Eaters. The episode sends the Enterprise back to Rigel 7, a planet previously visited by Captain Pike during a disastrous mission years earlier. Upon return, they discover a mysterious radiation field that erases the memories of anyone on the surface, leaving the crew struggling to remember who they are, why they're there, or even what Starfleet stands for. This setup allows Strange New Worlds to tackle memory loss in a way Star Trek has rarely explored. Unlike episodes that use amnesia for cheap thrills, Among the Lotus Eaters uses it to strip characters down to their core. What remains when identity, training, and duty are erased? What instincts guide us when we no longer remember our ideals? For Pike, this becomes a personal crucible. He's faced with the ghosts of the crew he lost during his first visit to Rigel 7, forced to confront guilt and grief without the comforting armor of his captaincy. For Nurse Chapel and Dr. Mabenga, their survival instincts are laid bare in harrowing sequences. But the episode's true brilliance lies in its central question: can Starfleet values, compassion, logic, cooperation, survive without memory? And the answer, quietly and beautifully, is yes. The human spirit as the final frontier. This is where Among the Lotus Eaters surpasses Carbon Creek. While Carbon Creek focused on Vulcans learning to understand humans, Strange New Worlds flips the script. It's not about aliens learning to be human, it's about humans rediscovering their own better natures, even when stripped of everything. There's a scene near the climax where Pike, still struggling with partial memory loss, sees an injured native Rigelian villager and instinctively helps. He doesn't know his mission, or even his name, but he knows that helping matters. That moment says more about Starfleet's ethos than a dozen speeches or prime directives ever could. Even more profound is the resolution. Pike doesn't just solve the radiation problem or defeat a villain. He chooses to remember and to forgive himself. The episode becomes not just a sci-fi story about radiation and forgetfulness, but a meditation on trauma, healing, and the necessity of self-compassion. Where Carbon Creek told a story about early cross-species trust among the Lotus Eaters lives it. It embodies Star Trek's optimistic future not in high-tech solutions or alien diplomacy, but in a simple, powerful truth. When stripped to our essence, the best of humanity still shines. Production, aesthetic, and emotional weight. Another way Strange New Worlds edges ahead is in execution. While Carbon Creek lovingly recreated 1950s America, Among the Lotus Eaters leans into haunting, mythological imagery. The ruined temples of Rigel 7 feel ancient and symbolic, almost like a Star Trek version of the Odyssey. The radiation field acts like a curse, one that forces heroes to remember who they are without relying on the past. Director Eduardo Sanchez, known for co-directing the Blair Witch Project, brings a grounded intensity to the visuals. The planet doesn't feel like a set, it feels like a place. The muted tones, harsh winds, and practical sets elevate the stakes beyond the usual away mission. And the performances, particularly Anson Mount's Pike, Ethan Peck's Spock, and Jess Bush's Chapel, give the script a gravity rarely seen in episodic sci-fi. A deeper layer. The ethics of memory. Among the Lotus Eaters also invites viewers to question whether memory defines morality. Are we good because we remember being good? Or is goodness something deeper? That philosophical thread runs throughout the episode, tying it to Trek's best tradition of exploring human nature through science fiction. Unlike Carbon Creek, which functions primarily as a prequel tale with moral overtones, Among the Lotus Eaters uses its premise to challenge assumptions about identity. That's an ambitious swing, and it lands. It also resonates with fans on a deeper level. In a world increasingly fragmented by information overload, where our sense of self is tied to social media, politics, and constant noise, the idea of memory loss isn't just science fiction. It's metaphor. What happens when we forget what we stand for? What happens when we lose our prime directive? Strange New Worlds dares to suggest that we can still find our way back. A spiritual successor, not a copy. What makes this all the more impressive is that Among the Lotus Eaters doesn't try to mimic Carbon Creek. There's no period nostalgia, no hidden Vulcan relatives, no winks at history. Instead, it reclaims the quiet power of standalone episodes to tell a different kind of story, one that's introspective, challenging, and ultimately hopeful.